Perfect. Hey guys, my name is Pete. I'm sure many of you have heard me bash on already about this, so I'm sorry for those that are hearing it for the fourth time, but I'm from the LSS, one of the committee members. Just wanted to give you a heads up that Law Ball is like a couple of weeks away. It's going to be an awesome night. The tickets are booking out pretty quick, and we actually have to close tickets a couple of weeks beforehand to let the venue know of like dietary requirements and numbers and all that sort of stuff. So get in, please, if you're interested. It is.
Find out how you could get interested.
Yeah.
Because it's fun, and you'll meet people. Like even if you think, oh, that does not sound like me at all, but you know, actually, especially those of you who this is your first semester, it means you get to party on, you get to meet a few people, you have some nice food, and you can bitch and moan about people like me. Of course, we'll be there for a little while, but not for very long. Like, just do it.
And it's like, I know it's like $140, which seems pretty steep, but it's 3 meals and it's like unlimited alcohol, so you can go nuts.
It's not like $140. It is $140. We're going to talk about
I was pitching it well here. I was pitching it well.
The consideration will be $140, but I happen
You're
to have
right.
it on good authority that the LSS, if you ask them nicely, will find some equity plan if you need a payment arrangement.
Absolutely.
And that's something that you should know about too, because they're much more interested in getting you to go to events and join in than they are in humiliating you, because you can't just put your hands on $140 every week.
Yeah, absolutely. The LSS know that, you know, we're all students here, and forking out $140 in one hand is quite a bit of money. So you can email equity at RMIT LSS, and only one person in the committee actually gets that email. So it's not like the whole committee even know that it's happening. One person takes care of that, and then you can just pay that off slowly. You might even be able to like pay a bit off before and a bit off after, but maybe don't repeat that. And don't share this recording. Yeah.
I am sharing it.
Anyway, it's going to be awesome.
There's OUA people as well.
And the venue actually it's at Bobby McGee's, I don't know if anyone knows, but it's got a giant donut wall, which is fantastic, and we can eat it at the end of the night, so it'll be good. It'll be good. The other thing I want to mention is the LSS are doing an amazing job at all the things that they do. However, there are about 3 or 4 of the committee members that are in their 3rd and final year at the JD, and they're finishing up at the end of this year. So the RMIT LSS is looking for people to jump on board, especially if you're in your 1st year. It means that you'll be able to stay with the LSS for a couple of years, a whole lot of different roles, and you don't need to have any sort of experience in any particular area. If you show a keen interest in publications or careers or whatever it is, then the handover is pretty thorough, and they can make sure that you've got a grasp on everything, especially as well because we're a bit of a small knit LSS. Everyone sort of chips in and helps each other. So if ever you feel like you're going to drop the ball, there'll be 10 other people to catch it. And I guarantee you it looks fantastic on your CV. Really great for networking. I know Caitlin, who is in this class, is actually our careers officer now at the LSS, and her job is literally to link in with other firms and check in with them. So like, what a great opportunity to get your name out there. So if you have any questions, please come and see me. I'm more than happy to have a chat too. But if you are interested, please come along to the general meeting on Thursday. It's in Building 13 of this week. No commitment, just come in. We have a chat about the finances and what's going on in upcoming events. And then if you have any questions, the whole committee will be there to have a few chats and discussions.
What time is that meeting?
It's at 5:30, Building 13, room, not sure. Yeah.
And can OUA students get involved?
We actually have an OUA officer, and her role is to make sure that the OUA students link in with the on-campus students and recognise that everything is for both on-campus and off-campus students. So definitely recommend. And here's Caitlin now, our careers officer. So yeah, come and chat to either Caitlin or I if you have any questions about the LSS, or if you want to just check in and see what it's about. Thanks.
Thank you. Hypothetical. Is it contract class?
Well, Tina is actually the staff liaison officer, and so she's like all for the LSS and whatnot. So shoot her up and give her an email.
Yep. She records. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks very much, Peter. I'm a big fan of the LSS too, and I reckon you should get involved if you can. And I'm quite sure that if you think it's a bit overwhelming and there's too much, then the more hands there are doing it, the greater the load is shared. But my experience has been they've been pretty open to making it work for as many people as possible. Which is great. And it's fabulous, Caitlin, that you're going out and actually talking to law firms. When I started teaching at RMIT, so many of my friends and colleagues were saying, I didn't even know RMIT had a law program. So it's kind of a bigger job in some ways than you might initially think, but it is really important for you guys as students to be showing off to the firms, to be getting your names out there, and so that's a really valuable role. So you should yell out if you need help, because you're helping everybody here. Today, what are we going to do? We are going to finish our journey discussing agreement. Let me just move us forward and see exactly where it is. This isn't the same slide pack as I looked at last time because I made it smaller so it wouldn't crash. But anyway, we'll just have to hope for the best that it doesn't crash. And we got to acceptance and unilateral contracts. I can't remember if we spoke about them or not, though. Can anybody actually remember if we did this bit? I know we didn't talk about Crown and Clark yet, so anyway, let's have it. So just let's go back before we actually, let's help me get some context by putting this into some context for you. So we're still talking about the big topic of agreement. In order to have a contract, we need an agreement which is made up of two parts. An offer, which is capable of acceptance on its terms, that has been accepted without variation, and that acceptance has been communicated to the offeror. Okay, it's getting a little bit more precise with our language now. It also needs to have what other three things? Agreement, intention, consideration, and certainty. So you'll be rolling those things off, and each of them will have more meaning to you as we go through each week. So the offer itself, we've spoken about a number of times, needs to encapsulate all of the DNA of the deal, all of the elements of the contract. So it needs to be capable of acceptance without variation. If it's accepted on a conditional or a varied basis, what is that? What's the problem there, or is there a problem?
Is it a counteroffer?
It's a counteroffer. So in fact, it's not an acceptance at all. In order for an agreement to be made, the offer needs to be accepted without change. If there is change, it's a counteroffer. Why does that matter? I could see that you were about to say something, Sarah, before. No? Why does it matter?
Because it cancels the original offer.
It does. It cancels, might cancel as well. It cancels the original offer. And effectively, an offer is withdrawn or revoked when it is rejected, and a form of rejection is making a counter-offer. So accepting 90% of the deals but wanting one change is a counter-offer. When might it look like it's a counter-offer but not be a counter-offer? Victor? When it's a request for information. So often we have to be really careful in a negotiation. Okay, so, and that can be a bit of a trick for the young players. You've got a very careful negotiation going back. You've finally got an offer, a document that's almost there, but your problem is that you don't want it to go away, but you would like to see a variation. So people will take great care to make sure that it is a request for information rather than alternative. Axel.
Not Tobias.
Not Tobias, actually.
Yeah.
I thought we settled last week that you didn't like being called not Tobias.
You can call me that if you like. But
Okay,
I have
thank
a
you.
question in regards to inquiry versus a request for information, are they the same thing? Or?
Most likely.
Yeah.
So an inquiry or a question or a request, so a clarification.
Yep, different sort of.
All of that language is something less than an alternative.
Okay.
So how are we going to, if we've got something that looks like it might be an alternative or it might be a request for information, how do we work out which one it is? Do we ask the party what they were intending?
Perhaps, maybe.
Yep, and that would be asking them for some subjective information perhaps. What kind of test might we use? We're going to use an objective test. So acceptance in the olden days, we did have quite a bit of subjective testing. And if you read Carlhill and Carbolic Smokeball carefully, the arguments are, so the Smokeball company raised some arguments that said, well, even if we made an offer, because you'll remember they were saying they didn't make an offer, but even if we did make an offer, well, if it was accepted, we didn't get communication of that acceptance. And so in exploring whether it was accepted, the court was pretty comfortable with just assuming that Mrs. Carlhill had accepted the offer. It went into a subjective test. But as the law has progressed, it's pretty clear that we will use an objective test. And so cases like Taylor and Johnson support that argument. So why do we have an objective test? Why would the courts want to have an objective test? What would the benefit be? Axel?
Could it be just in terms of, I can't think of the word right now, just more efficient, I suppose?
I think efficiency is exactly the right word. If we think about contract, going right back to the topic 1 stuff, which I know we didn't discuss very much in week 1, but we'll just keep coming back to in this way. If we think of a contract as creating a private law between individuals, and if we think of the purposes of having contract law is to create an efficient and regular and understandable way for commercial people to do business with each other, then if we use an objective test, we're going to get the same or a similar result each time when, by an objective look, what a reasonable person would, having the same information, would have thought, that gives us a similar answer each time. Where if the test is, let's go and ask Axel what he was thinking at the time, I don't want to cast any nasturtiums, as my kid used to say, but Axel might choose to remember his attitude or his view at the time in a way that might suit his legal case subsequently, particularly if he's well advised, and given that he's networking beautifully at the law ball with people like yourselves, he's probably going to have good lawyers if he's in his network, if he's not actually being one himself. So, just saying. I don't want to be the only person I know at the ball. As far as I understand it, I haven't heard of any of the other lecturers going. And I just assume, to be quite frank, I just assumed it's compulsory and I don't really have a choice. So I signed up to go. Yeah, because, I never have fun anywhere I go. But then I suddenly realised, actually none of my mates are going to be there. It's only going to be students. So I need people I know. So. Well, Tina's not going to be there, and she's my work mate, my work wife. So, unilateral contracts. Sorry, that could have gone in a really ridiculous direction, but I might just stop it right there. Unilateral contract. So, how is a unilateral contract accepted? By performance. So, the act of doing the thing that is required by the offeror creates the contract that leads to the offeror being bound to keep their promise. Now, when we get to consideration, that becomes really important. And it actually starts to make even more sense. I'm assuming it's making some sense to you at the moment, but it makes even more sense that there is this exchange of promises. So, we talked about, did we talk about this? We talked about the kittens. I think it's time to move on from kittens. Let's talk about, something's going completely wrong here. Let's just move out of that. Okay, let's talk about Crown and Clark. You might see the citation of this as R.V. Clark. R stands for Rex or Regina. We say the Crown when we say it out loud. Somebody asked me last week, and I've just remembered now, why we say and instead of versus, and if there are times when we say versus, and I forgot to look it up because it's just part of the language that I use. So if you are still really interested, please tell me and I will continue. So anybody remember the facts of this one? So Mr. Clark was assisting the police with their inquiries. And it turned out that he had some information about a bloke that led rise to a charge of murder. Now, the reason that Mr. Clark assisted the police with their inquiries is it was made very clear to him that he would, if he was helpful in relation to this other matter, he would get a lesser sentence. And subsequently, after sharing this information, he became aware that there was a reward for information leading to the successful prosecution of, in relation to a particular murder case. So he fronted up to claim his reward. And the bobbies said, hello, 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 we don't think that you should be entitled to this reward. So you can see what happened if you skim read the summary on the case. You can work backwards from there, I'm sure, from the slide. But let's think about the logic here. Why would it make sense? Well, what would the police be arguing? What would the police's argument have been when Mr. Clark went to collect his reward? Or do I need to go back a step before that? What would Mr. Clark be arguing? Will we do it that way?
Yeah.
Okay. What would Mr. Clark be arguing in order to claim the reward? What would he be saying?
I'll give you information.
I've given you the information. It's already happened, remember. I've given you the information. There's a reward. I accepted your offer. So it's a unilateral, rewards are basically unilateral offers. We've worked that out, right? So there was a unilateral offer. All I had to do was perform. I performed. This has led to the prosecution of the murderer. I want my 500 quid or whatever it was. Is that a logical argument? Pretty similar to Mrs. Carlisle, right? Okay. I did what you asked me to do. I took the carbolic smoke ball 2 times a day in accordance with the instructions on the package. Subsequently, I got the flu. I deserve my £100. Are they the same? Well, let's distinguish on the facts. Let's identify, are there different facts? You know one. Sorry? Valentina.
He knew about the reward after the fact, so he'd already given the information. It wasn't part of the offer. There was no...
So he's giving the information wasn't in response to the knowledge of the reward or the reward. He was actually giving the information so he could get a lighter sentence or a lighter dealing on his breaking and entry charge or whatever it was. But then again, let's devil's advocate here, and any of you want to stand up for Mr. Clark here, I'm thinking Mrs. Carlisle didn't take the smoke ball twice a day in accordance with the instructions on the leaflet because she wanted 100 quid. She did that in order to avoid getting a cold and flu. It's mean, isn't it?
Requesting damages, compensation, right? Whereas he's in some way...
But she brought an action in contract. She said, you promised me if I got a cold and flu after doing these things, that you would pay me 100 quid. So she brought the action in. You're right, the reason she wanted the 100 quid was to pay for an excessive medical bills or, and it was a bit like buying insurance, really. It was the bet she wanted to lose. She would have rather go on and not get a cold than get the payout. I mean, when you think about it, that's what insurance is, isn't it? You pay $700 to get your car insured in the hope that next year you'll pay exactly the same amount of money again, and they don't pay you out because nothing goes wrong. Valentina?
She bought the tablets knowing that's what she had to do.
Yes.
If the police had have said, we'll give you a lesser sentence and we'll give you the reward, then it would have been
Or
different.
are you aware that there's this reward as well? Absolutely, and now that's really important. And I know that was a little bit mean of me, but I really want to highlight how important it is to be really precise when it comes to distinguishing those facts. So a key difference between the two is that Mrs. Carlhill was aware of it. She might not have actually been meeting the bargain requirement. She might not have been doing it for that reason, but she at least was aware of it. It was part of the selling proposition. They shewed their sincerity, where Mr. Clark just wasn't even aware of it, so he didn't know about it. So I still think, frankly, it's a political decision. I do see that there is a policy element in there if every time every time we spoke to the bad guys, quote unquote, we were paying them money for information. That's not a precedent that we want to set. So I have no doubt there's a political undertone or a policy undertone to it. But here, the court found that you actually have to have knowledge of the offer in order to accept it. You can't just do something and not even know about it. So that's an exception to the objective approach. In determining whether an offeree accepted a unilateral offer, you can look to their subjective intent. You can look to why was he doing this? Why did he do this thing? Was he aware of the offer or not? So again, I've been having a bit of a banter over email with an OUA student, you know who you are out there, about whether or not where the contract is formed if you eat a piece of fruit while you're still in the supermarket. And again, think about that objective test and what the subjective intent is. Did you intend to pay for it or did you intend to steal it? They could make a difference, I don't know. Nice little quote. This is from the High Court of Australia, by the way, too. 1927 case, but still good law. While an offeree's conduct is normally assessed by reference to external manifestations, that's fancy, long-winded word for objective test, performance of a requested act will not give rise to unilateral contract if the evidence established that the offeree was not in fact acting on the faith of the offer. I like this language here too, acting on the faith of the offer. Oh, sorry, I've got the facts there. I wanted to didn't realise I had them. I'm just trying to find my pen. That acting on the faith of the offer. I think, again, when we get to talk about consideration, that will make a little bit more sense too, because we'll start to tease out how an acceptance is effectively the giving of another promise. So it's the offeror makes a promise and the offeree or the person who is accepting, so the offeree, if they do decide to accept, is either making a promise to do something in exchange for the receipt of the promise that the offeror has made, or in the case of a unilateral contract, agreeing to do something in consideration of the promise that is made, that will be performed when the contract is made. So we talked about the facts already, and so Acting Chief Justice Isaac said, acceptance is essential to contractual obligation because without it there is no agreement. And in the absence of agreement, actual or imputed, there is no contract. So very much a meeting of the minds is required. Justice Higgins said, although Clark's Act fulfilled the conditions contained in the reward offer, that would only raise a presumption that he did act on it, that he acted on the reward. But by his own express admission, he did not. He did not act on the faith of the offer. So no contract was found in that particular case. So, what we get out of this is really understanding that unless a person performs the condition of the offer, acting upon its faith or in reliance upon it, he doesn't accept the offer. So consideration is tied up into this idea of acceptance, offer and acceptance as well. That the act of accepting is either performing the consideration or promising to do something in exchange for the promise that the offeror is making to the offeree.
In that case, why isn't Clark framed in consideration terms if we were to take into account that Clark gave no consideration because he gave nothing up? In fact, he was benefiting already from taking that
So,
action.
well, again, in life as opposed to in a classroom, the consideration point is bound up in the acceptance point.
Yes.
So part of the reason why you need to have knowledge of the offer in order to accept it is because the consideration that is paid by accepting or promised when accepting is the bargain. It's part of the bargain. So if you're not aware of it, even if you're doing that thing, you can't be doing it as part of the bargain. So it's explaining why that link to consideration is explaining why that requirement is there, but it's come up at this point because we're talking about acceptance before we talk about consideration. Only lucky me, we're in consideration week, and I know that's where we're going, so I want to, and I know you've been reading about consideration more recently.
So, in a similar case in which the defendant was aware of the bargain but took the actions for their own benefit, could a consideration argument be put into place there to say that they gave nothing?
Yeah, it probably could, and so Woolen Mills would be a good example of that kind of argument. So it's not a reward case as such, although many of us might think that a rebate is a reward for doing something that government policy wants you to do. And ultimately the High Court in Woolen Mills held that, yes, you did those things, but you didn't do them in exchange for the promise of the rebate. You did them for a range of other reasons, and so the bargain quid pro quo connection wasn't there. So Woolen Mills is a good example of that. So, communicating acceptance. So as a general rule, an offer needs to be accepted before a binding agreement is formed. Acceptance needs to be communicated to the offeror. Sometimes, I've said it's a general rule here, an offeror might have a properly appointed agent. So communicating to that agent might be enough. Even if you just think about it, if I am accepting an offer of employment from a company, I'm always going to be communicating my acceptance of that offer to an agent of the company, because the company itself doesn't have a physical presence. It doesn't have corporal being. So it would be the directors or an employee who are technically agents of the company. And acceptance becomes effective when communication is received by the offeror, except for when it's not. So what's important here is the contract is made at the time and at the place that the offeror receives information that the offer has been accepted without variation. It's all very straightforward when we're in the same room, but it gets, oh really, what is going on with my slide pack today? This is what happens when you mess around. Let's start with LaTeX Finance and Knight. I might stop in a second and put the other slide pack in because that was clearly working last week when this one isn't. So, LaTeX Finance and Knight. Anybody want to have a go at explaining the facts of this case to me? You guys know I'm uncomfortable with the silence, don't you? You're working it really well. I'm very, very happy with that. Okay, let's see. How many of you have ever been involved in a hire purchase transaction? It's a very old way of buying things. These days it's pretty much been replaced by credit cards. Okay, so in a hire purchase or a lease scenario, what would happen is that the vendor of goods usually has a relationship with a finance company. And the finance company basically sells finance to customers. So Harvey Norman, they were in trouble for it fairly recently. You might remember, if any of you are interested in how they work, you might Google back there, like you could have 100 days or 5 years interest free. And effectively how the transaction worked is salespeople for the finance company would just be located in the white goods store, like a Harvey Norman's or a Good Guys or whatever it is. And if you wanted to buy a fridge or a washing machine, or in Mr. Knight's case, he wanted to buy a TV, and you either didn't want to or you couldn't pay for it yourself, you filled out an application form for finance. Now, Mr. Latex, and then basically the finance company will then, well, these days they can do credit checks on a mobile phone in the moment. And this is before there was consumer credit cooling off legislation or anything. But in this particular case, Mr. Knight fills out an application to borrow money to buy a TV. The application form is framed as an offer. So an offer to borrow, can anybody remember how much it was? I don't think I put it on the slide. I don't know, the equivalent of $700 for a TV. It would have set out what the interest rate was going to be, when the terms were, those kind of things. But it's effectively framed as, I, Mr. Knight, want to borrow some money for a TV. Please, I'll pay a little bit every month. I'll pay interest at X, and you've got security over the TV, and at the end of the term, when I've made the last payment, it belongs to me entirely. Something like that. Don't know exactly. On the form itself, it said there is no contract until LATEC accept the offer. Now, why, if you were LATEC, it's your form, right? You've decided what the form will be. You're the one who's stipulating what the interest rate is and all the rest of it. Why would you set it up that way? Why would you set it up so that your customer is making the offer?
So you can negotiate.
So you can, what are you negotiating if you're writing down the interest terms? And I mean, when did you last negotiate a form that was filled out, ready to go? So why? It's good. And it's actually worth remembering when you are, next time you're renewing, getting a new phone or something or other, have a look, see, are you making the offer or are they making the offer? Find out what happens if you try and change the terms. It's not like you can't buy a phone somewhere else. Like, have a bit of fun with it, see what happens. So why would that be a good business strategy? Why would you do it that way? Sorry?
Credit check, time for a credit check.
Credit check. So, and why would they want their time for a credit check? Why would they want to do that?
Because they wouldn't want to accept somebody with bad credit.
They want control. So remember the number of times that we've spoken about the person who has the power to make the contract is the offeree. So if LATEC is the offeree, basically there's a binding offer. Sure, it can be withdrawn at any time, but Mr. Knight probably doesn't know that and probably isn't going to withdraw it. Then risk is relatively low in relation to that, and they've got the control. They can go and do credit checks. They can go and see what his history is. They can find out whether he's, bought a TV off every purveyor of TVs in the high street. Do all of that kind of thing. So, and basically, what they did is they processed it. They saw Mr. Knight was fine. They hit accept. I don't remember exactly how he got the TV. I am going to assume, as is the way with these things, when the shop would have held it for a few days and then delivered it, when the finance company didn't tell them not to. Every month or so, they would do a reconciliation. The finance company would say, well, we financed 20 television sets in your shop this month, and probably pay them once a month or so, but that's between the television and the finance company. So Mr. Knights got his TV. He watched it for a little while. I don't know, Coronation Street just wasn't turning out the way he thought it would. Have no idea why, but he decided he didn't want the TV anymore, so he took it back to the shop. Some years later, he got a letter of demand for a very large amount of money because he hadn't paid LaTeX Finance. He said, well, hang on a minute. Well, I guess his very clever lawyers had a look at the documents and they said, well, hang on a minute. You made an offer to purchase this finance or to enter into this finance agreement, but it was never accepted. Or if it was accepted, the acceptance wasn't communicated to you. So LaTeX, so the issue in the case was, had LaTeX communicated, or had they properly accepted Knight's offer of finance? They'd stamped the form, the TV had gotten to him, they had presumably advanced the money to the shop. Presumably the shop never told them that the TV had been returned, I don't know. Does that even matter? So is there an acceptance in this case? Victor?
There wasn't any acceptance in this case, but I just have a question. I'm not sure with the relationship that LaTeX has with the financing company or whatever, but
Well, LaTeX is the financing
yeah.
company. So we've got three potential parties in this deal. The seller of the TV
Okay, yeah.
and the seller of finance and Mr. LaTeX, who was the potential borrower of money and purchaser of a TV.
Okay. I was going to say, can't the giving of the TV constitute as acceptance?
Well, let's talk about that. Could the giving or the handing over of the TV by the shop be communication by LaTeX that they had accepted the loan application, the offer to purchase finance? It's funny language, isn't that, purchase finance? But we are purchasing finance. We pay them more than they give us.
It's implied that the finances come through if they give you the TV, if they gave Mr. Knight the TV, but he hasn't had acceptance from the offeree.
From the offeree.
Yeah.
So no communication of acceptance from the offeree. He's also returned the TV, and that's with a different organisation. So, and when you think about it, how many of you buy things with a credit card? I can put both hands up. When I go to Woolworths and I buy fruit and vegetables with my credit card, who am I contracting with? Woolworths for the fruit and vegetables. Anyone else? The bank, the provider of my credit card. I am actually, there's a contract between me and them where I'm effectively saying, every time I use this card, I'm authorising you to advance some money to the shop where I've used it in exchange for my promise to either pay you back within 55 days or pay a large amount of interest as well as the capital back in accordance with those terms. They're two different contracts. And then there's a third contract, which is credit card companies and banks with the vendors, which is around how the money goes from the credit card into the shop. So there's multiple contracts that are going on. And some of them are ongoing contracts. You know, when you sign up for a bank account or a credit card or whatever, you're entering into a contract there. Then that's effectively what that's doing, right? And the shops are also, when they enter into their banking arrangements, they've got terms that say, bank, you're going to provide us with software that will do this and chip readers that do that, and we're going to reconcile every day, and that money is going to be washed into this account, and that's how it works, and they pay for that. That's why many places will actually say it costs you more if you're going to use a credit card, because that's to cover their costs of dealing with that separate contract. So, basically, it was held that the ordinary rule here applies. So, no contract is made until acceptance of the offer has been communicated. And if you're going to vary the rule, you need to make it clear in the offer. So, it could have been, it was open for LATEC to say, we will consider your offer, and if we don't respond within 7 days, you can consider it accepted. Or if we advance, or if we notify the shop and they release the TV, it'll be accepted. They didn't do any of those things. Acceptance can be provided by the doing of an act without any communication, as it is in Carlhill and Carbolic Smoke, but it needs to there needs to be a logical reason for that to happen. So it needs to be implied into the terms of the offer itself. And given that LATEC had engineered its documentation to offer itself the greatest protection, to give itself the ability to say no to people, it couldn't then rely on the fact that it didn't communicate a yes to then get money back later on. And presumably it had a right of recourse against the shop anyway that probably should have refunded it the money. Would have been quite funny if it had refunded the money to Mr. LATEC, Mr. Knight, but I don't know if that happened. Axel?
Is this covered by any legislation, or is it all precedent?
These days, the kind of financing transactions we're talking about are absolutely covered by both the Australian consumer law and the banking laws, consumer credit laws.
Yep.
And no doubt, if any of you have been following the Royal Commission, there'll be a whole heap more of those rules that are going to come out very, very soon. So these days there's a cooling off period, there's a range of other things. The Australian law has tended to deal with the provision of finance by disclosure, so get rid of the risks by what we do is we just bombard purchases of credit or financial products with lots of information about all the risks in small print or smallish print, and you think, I can't read that. Even I don't read it, and I've been a practicing lawyer for 30 years, I'm just like, yeah. Pyramid went broke, things happen. So, ultimately, one of the things that we get from LATEC, which is really important, is that at the end of the day, a contract is about a private law. So the parties can come up with a way of negotiating or a way of managing their private contract. But if you're going to do something that's not the general rule, you need to be explicit about it. And because LATEC wasn't explicit about it, the contents of that form, so the offer that Mr. Knight made, didn't provide any particular way for them to get through there, then the general rule applies. So Justice Jacobs said, an offer has not been accepted until acceptance has been communicated, and that rule can be varied, but the variation needs to be clear. Questions, concerns, frustrations? Anybody want to run off and buy TV? Grace?
So in those two, in the slide previous to this one, the two different ways that there can be a variation of the general rule.
Yep.
Are they joint?
So as in aggregate, do you need both of them? No, one or the other.
Okay.
That's enough. So any variation must be made clear. Generally, it'd be one of those two would need to do that. So it could be your unilateral acceptance, so the Carlhill and Carbolic smoke ball approach. And Carbolic is problematic in some ways because like Crown and Clark, for example, will tell you, well, you don't if you don't know about it, you can't accept it. So you need to know about it. If it's a unilateral offer, it's the doing of the act. The doing of the act might not be precisely in response to the keeping of the promise, but it might be the negative of that, as Carl Hill is, where this is a bet I'm hoping to lose, like insurance, in other words. I pay you now on the basis that if I have a car accident or my house burns down, you'll pay me more money, but we both hope that next year I just pay you the same amount again, and we keep continuing on in that way. So we've got that approach, or that express or implied. And we'll talk much more about express or implied terms weeks 9, 10 and 11 as we start to look at what the actual contract terms are.
So is the first just for unilateral?
Yes. The doing of the act without any communication. Hang on a sec. Yes, sorry. I'm just thinking how many of you have bought it? I bought a cup of coffee this morning and didn't say a word. Okay, so I've just walked in, I was on the phone, I've pointed, I've got my money out. I know, I'm rude. And I go there all the time, they're very nice and I'm a good tipper. So I'm thinking it all balances out. But there was no actual word communication, but there were other actions in the... So it wasn't just... it's not like I just didn't show up and now I'm complaining that they didn't give me a coffee, right? Which is effectively what latex happens. It's you didn't show up, now I'm complaining that we didn't come, but now we want our money back.
So if the vending machine breaks, is that a breach of contract? You've given me the Coke?
Okay, what do you reckon? Vending machines are quite interesting when you think about how the contract works.
I guess you put the money in, so you make the offer, and you say, this is my money, can I have that? And then they can accept or decline that.
But if they decline it, it should be giving you your money back, right?
Yeah.
So if the machine is broken, is there a breach of contract? And it also happens in a roundabout order. Often you have to put your money in first, and then you say what you want. So the machine is an invitation to treat, or an invitation to purchase treats. You then, these days, you're normally putting a keypad in, but in fact, I've noticed the one that's over in Building 13, if you use a credit card, I never have it. It actually takes more money than anything in the machine is worth. First, make sure you have enough money, then you can hit the buttons, you get your treat, and then it reverses part of the transaction before it finishes. So how does a contract work there?
Well, it's a pre-authorization of the credit card. It doesn't actually take the money.
Yeah, exactly. So what it's doing is it's working, the acceptance, I would say that in that case you're putting in an offer to buy something. Your offer is, you're basically qualifying yourself as an offeror by the pre-acceptance. So at that point, you then hit the buttons. So you've actually, the second part of your offer is, firstly, I am of the class of humans who are able to accept or to deal with this invitation to treat. I am going to qualify. Then I'm going to say which of the particular tasty treats that I want. Then the robot effectively accepts that offer by delivering. And if it gets broken and it doesn't respond, I think it's in breach of contract.
But there's a remedy for that. You call them
Well, it's not really a remedy, let's use proper language. But yeah, but in fact, and it's not a contract with the machine. Our contract is with the company that used the machine. Just as my contract at Coles or Woolworths is not with the cashier, it is with the firm that she works for.
And what if you make a mistake? What if you press the wrong button? Is that just your own negligence?
Well, let's think about from an offer acceptance. Who controls? Who controls the making of the deal?
Yep.
And that's if you've made the wrong offer, you've put the wrong. Then that offer is accepted.
What about the Electronic
So-
Transactions Act and the mistake?
Now we're talking. There we go.
Well,
We're going deep now.
well, let's do that. Electronic communication. When does it happen?
So the actual communication said that if you make a mistake on the input of the form, is that, or no, is it the other way?
There is something on the input of a form on a web form.
Opportunity to revoke
Yeah.
or alter.
That's
the
true.
input.
So is that, it's
That's
not
on a
web
form, but
but
this
it's
is not a web form. This is a pressing of buttons on a robot.
Depends on the language.
So when some
It is
smart
now
vending machine gets a little touch screen.
I can see you guys.
Yeah.
I think I can see you bringing a class action against the machines. I think that's actually. Let's all rise against the machines.
We've got to stop the sound there from happening.
I watched Deadpool 2 on the weekend, and so those jokes are right in my mind. So I just want to say lazy writing. Anything more there? No, I don't think so. So, what are the exceptions to the general rule? So this is an area where can get caught up really easily, and particularly the postal rule. You will get caught up in the postal rule. The thing to remember is the postal rule is an exception to the general rule. Justice Jacobs said, in situations involving unilateral offers where the offeror did not expect or require notice of acceptance, so the Carl Hill Carbolic smoke ball, that if every time you decided to purchase something where there was a money-back guarantee or some sort of payment if something goes wrong, you actually had to notify, because you bought it from the shop, and you had to go and notify the manufacturer you were going to deal with their money-back manufacturer's guarantee, that would be unworkable. That the fact that they're actually advertising that there is an implied arrangement that you only have to tell them when it goes wrong. And when you think about how many of you bought something and there's a silly little warranty card in the box that they want you to fill in and send away, in some ways that's a reaction to things like Carl Hill, where they're thinking, well, we want to know if we've provided a mechanism for acceptance, then maybe of our manufacturer's guarantee, then maybe we'll be able to say no and not honour the guarantee if people haven't sent it through. Now, there's legislation these days that stops that from happening, but that used to happen a bit. You have to attach your receipt, and some of them will tell you have to keep it. I'm a big fan of buying gadgets at Aldi. I can't stop. I go in there and buy stuff. They all have exactly the same guarantee card in them, right? Every single one of them. They say, you have to write on it what the thing is, and you're supposed to staple your receipt to it. Does that happen? I'm not going to say on the recording whether it happens or not, just in case I ever have to have a fight. But does it matter? Probably not. It's just going to be a bigger fight, because there's a whole branch of the consumer law that's going to help me out there. And where an offer expressly or impliedly provides for acceptance to be communicated in a particular way, so that acceptance is deemed communicated when that manner is adopted, whether or not it's actually received. So if LaTeX had said, once you get your television, you'll know that the finance has gone through. If they'd actually said that, then getting the television would have been enough. But they didn't say that in this case, so there was no exception to the general rule, and the general rule is contract is made at the time and the place where acceptance is communicated to the offeree. And that just didn't happen, so no contract was made. Okay, no words are used, but there might be some sort of conduct from which acceptance might be affected. Think about it. A nod, a wink, a shake of the hand. Any of you back in the olden days ever go and stand in a stock exchange? Or ever been to a livestock auction where there's just complete chaos, people moving and whatever, and stuff is being done with hand signals? Watch Trading Places, anything like that? You guys really need to get out less and watch more TV, I can tell. So basically, we use an objective test. If there is conduct that a reasonable person would think manifested assent, then we don't need words. A reasonable person, if I make Grace an offer and she comes up and shakes my hand and says nothing more, she's wary of my offer. She's not prepared to shake my hand without knowing what it is. a reasonable person would assume that she was accepting the offer. So, and again, the approach is, would a reasonable person regard the conduct as an unqualified assent to the terms of the offer? Again, unqualified. Why does that matter? Because if it's qualified, it's not an acceptance. It might be a counteroffer. It might be seeking additional information. It might be any other thing, but what we need is an unqualified assent to the terms of the offer. Can silence alone be acceptance? And the short answer is no. You will need something, not just silence. We talked about this very briefly last week. It's quite common, actually, to see even in solicitors' letters of demand, if we don't get a response from you by next Tuesday, we will take our offer of settlement to be accepted and we'll move on from there. See it all the time. But yeah, I'm quite sure it's slightly unethical, but I don't know if you can be slightly unethical. I think you're either, it's a kind of binary situation, isn't it? But anyway, but I have seen it quite regularly. Again, acceptance can be inferred from silence with something else. And again, the same test. So I don't think there's anything particularly new on this. Let's talk about, I've got the next slide here. Oops, wrong one. Is Feldhaus and, go away. Feldhaus and Bindley. No, it's not. No, sorry. Just do that. Sorry. I'm just filling your time for a second. Continue recording. There we go. Just do that. Sorry about that. You will see there's a bit of a theme to the facts in many of the cases in contract law. We have a number about horses. We have quite a few about tickets. You will never, ever, ever want to go on a cruise. Kind of thinking you're too young to want to go on a cruise already, but you will never want to go on a cruise. You will never leave your hat or your cloak or your bag at a train station, and you will probably never get anything dry cleaned again, just after the cases in this particular subject. So basically there was an uncle and he wanted to buy his nephew's horse. The nephew was auctioning off a whole heap of his farm assets. So the uncle wrote to the nephew and said, if I hear no more about him, I shall consider the horse mine at £30 and 15 shillings. So the nephew, I think the uncle was, I don't know what the uncle's name was. Nephew was Feldhaus. He engaged Bindley, who was an auctioneer, to sell all the farm stock. The nephew didn't say anything to his uncle, didn't accept the offer. Told Bindley to put the horse aside and not sell it at the auction because it had already been sold to the uncle. So on a subjective test, the nephew believed he had accepted the offer. He intended to sell his horse. Bindley, unfortunately, sold the horse at the auction. The uncle first sued Mr. Bindley in tort and said, you've interfered with my ability to buy this horse. Anyway, ultimately was unsuccessful. So the nephew sued in contract and said, you breached the contract by selling this horse. You caused me to breach a contract by selling this horse. And Bindley said, well, actually, my instructions were to sell everything that belonged to you, and you actually weren't bound. That horse didn't belong to your uncle at that stage. There was no contract made because you hadn't accepted the offer based on the facts. Okay, is that all making sense? So what happened? The court needs to find, in order for the nephew to succeed and be able to get the money back for the uncle, he's got to be able to demonstrate that he had a contract with his uncle to sell the horse. For Bindley to succeed, Bindley needs to demonstrate that there is no contract and that... So what would he be arguing?
There's no acceptance.
There's no acceptance because it's an objective test, because there was no communication of that acceptance. And that, so the question then goes to these words: if I hear no more about him, I'll consider the horse mine. Does that create a contract? No. So Justice Weil said, no contract between the uncle and the nephew because the nephew hadn't communicated acceptance. Subjective test doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what's in your own mind. What matters is what you say and do. He hadn't communicated the intention of the uncle or done anything to bind himself. No contract. Too bad, so sad.
So why doesn't the nephew sue the auctioneer for being a useless auctioneer?
Well, they
So
did that in
what's the
the uncle did that in tort. It
The
might,
nephew claim against the auctioneer saying, I told you not to sell the horse, now you sold it.
but the auctioneer's actual contract was to sell everything on the farm that belonged to the nephew. So he wasn't actually in breach of his contract. That was really the key point in this case.
So
But-
the nephew saying, don't sell this horse,
Yeah.
was not part of the contract.
No, well, that would be a variation of the contract subsequently. But if he actually said it belongs to my uncle, but it turned out that wasn't true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. He probably wasn't a useless auctioneer. But hey, he gave us some law.
So, with the situation of LATEC and Knight, we talked about the ability to vary the conditions of acceptance. Could you not say that the uncle had varied acceptance to be silence?
But silence alone it's not going to be enough because you can't know. Like, the uncle doesn't even know whether the nephew has received the offer, is even aware of it
Yeah.
at that stage.
So in that similar situation, you're not able to add a term to a contract that says silence constitutes acceptance.
No, you might be able to, in the sense, you'd need something more. So I think LATEC and Knight, for example, it would have been, we'll authorise delivery of the television to you when it's accepted.
Yeah.
Or we will put a list of all of the ones that we accept in our window
Yeah.
once a week. Or done something to manifest some sort of acceptance that wasn't just navel gazing.
So
And can you see what the policy implications would be if they were just allowed to hit accept or not? What they could do is just keep everything in the in tray and then later on decide what's in their best interest
Yeah.
to accept or not accept, because they'd just be maintaining that control. Empinall is a good one as well. So Empinall was a property developer. He verbally engaged a couple of architects to act as project managers for a development. So the architects sort of got started. Imagine that, professionals getting started before having contracts in place, but it does happen. And they said they put together a form of contract, and the person who was the director, so he's Mr. Jury, I think, yeah, Mr. Jury was his name, apparently didn't sign contracts. He didn't think contracts were good for business. We work in a relationship of trust. So the engineers said, well, or the architect said, yeah, well, but these are the terms on which we do business. But ultimately the contract wasn't signed. A couple of progress payments were made though, and then Empinall went bust. And so stopped paying. So the question for the liquidator was, did the liquidator owe this money to the architects or not? If there was a contract, the liquidator had to find those funds to pay the architects. If there was no contract, then basically the money would be dispersed in different ways. So what do we think? Victor?
The company had the opportunity to decline the services, but
Yep.
nonetheless accepted and benefited from
The accepted and benefited, I think, really helps here, particularly when the language they said is, the language was, we don't sign contracts. But all of their activities, they ordered more work after seeing the terms, they paid in accordance with those terms. So objectively, there was no reason for the architects to think that those terms were rejected. They just knew that the contract wasn't signed. Contract it didn't relate to land as such, or creation of an interest or a transfer in land, so there was no requirement for any kind of formality. So on an objective test, you could see what the terms were. The architects have said, we'll do business on this basis. They were doing business on that basis, and the conduct of the property developers showed that they were. Good insight. Yep, we've talked about those things. Again, objective test. You need to apply an objective test to determine whether there was an assent to the offer. And you're using the point of view of a reasonable bystander. So here the court found that Empinel did more than just remain silent. They took the benefit of the services, they knew that they needed to pay for them, they had reasonable opportunity to reject the terms of the offer. It was reasonable to believe that they understood what the contract was. Justice McHugh, where an offeree with a reasonable opportunity to reject the offer of goods or services takes the benefit of them under circumstances which indicate they were to be paid for in accordance with the offer, it is open to the tribunal of fact to hold that the offer was accepted according to its terms. And for my lovely OUA student who's struggling with the eating a banana in the supermarket question, slightly different when we've got an invitation to treat, but I think the logic still flows. The ultimate test for determining acceptance by conduct: would a reasonable bystander regard the conduct of the offence, of the offeree, that should be, including their silence, as signalling that the offer had been accepted? So, general rule: acceptance is effective at the time and the location it's received. Acceptance takes place when and where it's received, and acceptance won't be effective until the offeror actually receives the communication. Okay, because my slide pack's a little bit broken, I just want to go and swap it to the other one. Can we take 2 breaks today, and we'll just do 10 minutes now, and we'll do 10 minutes a little bit later?